Today we look at 4 strange disappearances within the state of Victoria in Australia. It's not unusual for people to get lost in Victoria's remote and rugged high country, but it is strange for them to remain missing. In the past 12 months, 4 people have disappeared within a 60-kilometre radius, leaving police and locals baffled. First, we look at Russell Hill and Carol Clay. It's what wasn't found in the search for Russell and Carol that stands out to Detective Inspector Andrew Stamper. The veteran officer knows the pair's camping trip had initially gone to plan. Russell picked Carol up from her house in Pakenham on the outskirts of Melbourne on March 19th, and the pair headed east, bound for the remote Wonnangatta Valley. Russell, 74, and Carol, 73, had given slightly different return dates to their families, a point Inspector Stamper puts down to Russell having a fairly flexible schedule. It's also true that Russell's family, including his wife, thought he was camping alone. Friends say since Russell's retirement 2 years ago, he's been known to head off on solo road trips. It was only with his disappearance that those close to him learnt that Carol, a former Country Women's Association president, was on some of those getaways. After their disappearance, police were asked if the pair, who had reportedly known each other for more than 20 years, could have run away together. It's a prospect Inspector Stamper sees as highly unlikely. Russell and Carol are among 4 people who have gone missing over the past 12 months within a 60-kilometre radius of each other. The others are Niels Becker, who did not return from a hike near Mount Sterling in October, and Conrad Whitlock, who was last seen on Mount Buller last July. The Wonnangatta Valley lies in the dense bushland between the popular ski resorts of Mount Buller and Mount Hotham. You can only access the valley with a forward drive, and in the winter the roads are completely closed. On this trip, Russell drove into the valley on a rough forward drive path known as the Becker Spur Track, a road he'd built decades earlier while working as a contract logger. The valley itself is a place with a dark history. Sometime in December of 1917 or January of 1918, the manager of the Wonnangatta cattle station, James Barclay, was shot dead. The station cook, John Banford, was suspected of the murder, but in November of 1918, he was also found dead, with a bullet lodged in his skull. The murders have remained unsolved for the past century. The Wonnangatta Valley has become a sort of dark tourism attraction, a spot where campers can sit around a fire in the black of night and scare each other with a good ghost story. The trip to the Wonnangatta Valley was Russell's 3rd visit to the region in a month. At the end of February, he and Carol had travelled through the high country, stopping at a camping spot called Pike's Flat, about 60 kilometres from the Wonnangatta Valley. Then, on March 11, Russell told his friends and family he was heading to the camp alone on the King Billy track between Wonnangatta and Mount Buller. Russell's friend of almost 30 years, Robbie Ashland, says it was on the Kings Billy track about a year earlier that Russell and another mate had an encounter with a bushman who has been dubbed the Button Man. He's a man who reportedly spends weeks camping alone in that remote country and gets his nickname from his habit of shaving down deer antlers to make buttons. Robbie says Russell encountered a man who was agitated and let them know he didn't want them to be camping there. They just called him the Angry Deer Hunter because they didn't know him as anything else. Inspector Stamper says police have spoken to a number of people who live in or spend time in the bushland around the Wonnangatta Valley, including some with concerning and antisocial habits. But the detective says police have no suspects and have not been able to connect anyone with the disappearances of Russell and Carol. Robbie Ashland is the last person known to have spoken to Russell. They were part of an amateur radio club that would chat on their radios each day at 6 p.m. The group is made up of men who like camping, hunting and fishing, outdoorsy types who use the radio to communicate when they're out of phone reception. On the night of March 20, While Russell and Carol were camping in the Wonnangatta Valley, Russell spoke to 3 or 4 club members, including Robbie. When Robbie didn't hear from Russell the next night, he wasn't worried. But when he was missing the second and third night, that is when he said to his wife, "It's time to go to the police." When police got to Russell's campsite, they found the remains of a fire that had burnt so hot it had swallowed up his tent and left black stains down the side of his forward drive. And there was no trace of Russell or Carol. Police have since narrowed their disappearance down to an 18-hour window between the radio call that ended at 6:30 p.m. on March 20 and 2 p.m. the next day when other campers came upon the burnt campsite. Police chemists have not been able to determine the cause of the fire, but Inspector Stamper says it's being treated as suspicious. The fire is a big part of what makes us concerned about this incident. Drones. Drones are a lot of fun and have grown to be a popular hobby for anyone that enjoys the outdoors. Russell owned a drone he would frequently take with him on these camping getaways. Most of Russell and Carol's belongings were found in Russell's distinctive forward drive. The only things police couldn't account for were Russell's drone and his mobile phone. Inspector Stamper says both items could have been destroyed beyond recognition in the fire, but it would have been out of character for Russell to leave expensive items in a tent. Russell's drone has become an object of intense interest to the police and an object of intense speculation for the public. There are plenty of people in the high country who will tell you that Russell and Carol would be alive if it weren't for that drone. As Roxanne, the holiday house owner in Mansfield, puts it, there are lots of people worried that Russell accidentally saw something he wasn't meant to while flying the drone overhead. What she's referring to is a drug crop. The theory might sound wild, but others in Victoria will remember the case of hiker Warren Mayer, who disappeared in the Yarra Ranges National Park in 2008. Police found a cannabis crop while searching for him, and later received a tip-off alleging he was murdered when he stumbled across a marijuana operation. Could something similar have happened to Russell and Carol? We know the community has those concerns, Inspector Stamper says. But he says police are not aware of any drug activity in the area, and the search effort, which involves rescuers on foot, horseback, as well as helicopters and drones, had found no evidence of a drug crop. The other issues that cast doubt on this theory is the drone itself. Russell had an app on his phone for the drone, but had not uploaded any footage to his account from the Wonnangatta trip. Another theory is that Russell's drone went down in the bushland, and the pair might have gotten lost looking for it, but police have not been able to find any flight path data from the trip. While Inspector Stamper says that doesn't mean a flight didn't occur, it does mean if it did happen, it's a flight that has left no digital trace. After months of searching and investigating the disappearances, what Inspector Stamper has been left with is a long list of things that haven't been found, including Russell's phone and drone, any drug crops, any hint that this was a staged disappearance, any suspect, or any item at all connected to Russell or Carol. And it's all that missing information, along with the burnt out tent, that leads Inspector Stamper to suspect foul play. I find it more likely that there has been some sort of involvement of a third party, or third parties, and something has happened to Russell and Carol, and they've either been concealed in that area or taken from that area, he says. We are looking at four-wheel drivers, hunters, fishers, campers, people who are competent travelling in that area and have the equipment to do so, Inspector Stamper says. Police are still calling for anyone in the Wonnangatta Valley on the days around March 20 to contact them, even if they didn't come across Russell and Carol. They believe somewhere there is someone who knows what happened to Russell's drone, how that fire started, and what exactly happened to Russell and Carol. About 20 kilometres from the Woonongata Valley is a section of the Australian Alpine Walking Track, or the AAWT, where a 39-year-old Niels Becker was last heard from before he disappeared in October last year. Niels set off on what was to be a 5-day hike through the high country as a birthday present to himself. He'd spent 6 months training for the grueling hike by taking long walks with a heavy pack near his home in Melbourne. He'd gone to Timbertop, the mountain campus that Year 9 students at Geelong Grammar attend, and he'd continued to hike in the high country as an adult. His father, Pierre Becker, described Niels as an independent person with a passion for Christian country music. Speaking to media after his son disappeared, Pierre said Niels' love of the mountains could be seen in his poetry. Senior Sergeant Damien Keegan, who helped coordinate the search, says Niels was well prepared and well equipped for his hike. He took a mobile phone with him and told his family of his plans. The track follows the Australian Alps from Victoria all the way to the Australian Capital Territory. Niels started at Upper Jameson Hut, south of Mount Buller, and then hiked the Valenjo-Gantner Hut, his last known location. Here, Niels sent a text message to his family saying he would head to Mount Sterling before looping back to his car. Senior Sergeant Keegan believes something happened to Niels on the 4th day of his hike, after he sent his text to his family. He says Niels had planned to leave the AAWT that day and follow a small track to Mount Sterling. Senior Sergeant Keegan believes Niels may have delayed the start of his 4th day hike because of poor weather, and then he had to cram a long and difficult walk into fewer hours of daylight. He says this could have affected Niels' ability to distinguish a walking path from a track formed by deers, wombats, or wild dogs. The experienced police officer doesn't think Niels made it to the end of his hike that day. He says the spot Niels intended to camp on his 4th night was close to Mount Buller, and it had phone reception. He believes Niels would have made phone communication with his family again if he made it to the end of the 4th day. Much of the police search was focused on an area of about 7,000 square kilometres around Mount Sterling. The searchers also went back to the beginning of Niels' journey, retracting his trip along the AAWT on foot. Police were looking for a clue, no matter how small, that Niels had been through that particular area. They were hoping to find a food wrapper, a hat, a piece of clothing, or another hiker who saw him after he left the Valenjo-Gantner Hut. However, police never found a sign of Niels around Mount Sterling. It's why the case has stayed with Senior Sergeant Keegan. That's the big thing you struggle with each day, you know. Have we missed something? Senior Sergeant Keegan says he doesn't believe there was foul play involved. I personally believe it's an unfortunate hiking accident, and that, coupled with the weather, has impacted his ability to survive, he says. He remains hopeful that there's a hiker who saw something that could help police find Niels' final resting place. But perhaps the most inexplicable of all the high country disappearances is that of Conrad Whitlock, who was about 30 kilometres from the Valenjo-Gantner Hut when he went missing. The Melbourne businessman was driving up the road to Mount Buller early on the morning of July 29, 2019, when he stopped his car on the side of the road at a spot called Unnamed Corner. He's not been seen since. The story of how he wound up at Unnamed Corner is just as odd as his disappearance, however. Conrad's wife, Mandy Whitlock, says the day before her husband went missing, the pair went for their usual Sunday lunch at a restaurant. They met as children in Melbourne, both kids who had migrated to Australia from the UK with their families. They had been married for more than 50 years when Con went missing. Mandy says they were a close couple. For much of their working lives, they ran businesses together. Before Con disappeared, they were operating a bull bar business. He'd oversee the work in the factory, and Mandy took care of the books at home. The pair also had a love of adventure. For 20 years, they headed up to Mount Buller every weekend of the ski season. The road Conrad disappeared from is one that Mandy estimates he had driven hundreds of times in his life. During that last Sunday lunch, Mandy says they chatted about car racing and a possible trip back up to Mount Buller for a visit. When they went to bed that night, Con warned his wife he might be out of the house before she woke. For years, he had been in the habit of rising early, heading out for breakfast and starting work at the factory early. But that Monday was a little different. Con had been battling a persistent headache for a couple of weeks, and his doctor said he needed to get a scan. He couldn't get an appointment until Tuesday, but Con told Mandy he'd go in early on Monday and see if any spots had opened up. When Mandy woke the next morning, she was alone. But she didn't worry. She thought she knew where her husband was. That day, she was with an accountant all day working on the end of financial year accounts for the business. Mandy left messages on Con's phone a couple of times and checked if he was at the factory. In the afternoon, she hadn't heard from her husband. She rang the medical centre but was told Con hadn't been there all day. Mandy spoke to their business manager who said he would try to track Con's phone using an app. He called back and said, "It is nearly at Mount Buller." That is when Mandy said, "Oh my god, something is really wrong." Police found Con's BMW at unnamed corner right where the phone's tracing app had indicated. Con's jacket, phone and wallet were all in the car, but he was not. Mandy says police were able to use road cameras to trace Con's movement, from him leaving the estate where the couple lived at 3 a.m. until he drove through the Mount Buller ticket point at 6 a.m. After that, police relied on dashcam footage from passing cars. Mandy says he was sighted until his car pulled over at about 6:30 a.m. Then there was like a 10-15 minute gap where no cars went past him, Mandy says. Those 10 to 15 minutes are crucial, because when the next car went past, Con's car was empty. Police still don't know what happened in those minutes. They set up a search from the car, but this was not the kind of place you would take a stroll. When I went with my friend, we had a look over the edge, and it's just this sheer drop that is a complete and utter jungle of fallen trees and shrubbery that is so dense, no one in their right mind would want to step off there and walk any distance. Con knew Mount Buller well, and he had never been a hiker. The searchers went over and over the area around the car, but didn't find a trace of Con. They also searched the nearby Hokwa River, but found nothing. Con's disappearance has left Mandy, his wife of 5 decades, his skiing partner and race car navigator, with many more questions than answers. Mandy says she's had to think of all the possibilities, including whether Con had intended to end his own life. But Mandy says that simply didn't make any sense. We had just bought this new race car. He was so enthusiastic about it. He'd arranged for some coaching and he had already raced in it, she says. The business was going fine, we didn't have any hassles. There was just nothing to indicate that he was concerned about anything. She dismisses the idea of foul play. The police went through his computer and his phone and they couldn't find anything that indicated there was something not right, she says. It's not like he had any enemies. But still, there are the questions. She doesn't know why Con got up at 3 a.m. and drove without stopping to Mount Buller. She doesn't know why Con stopped at unnamed corner, when he should have known he was just a couple minutes away from the ski village resort and car park. If he had a stop to go to the toilets, he would have known he was so close to the proper facilities, she says. Also, she doesn't know why Con didn't go to the medical centre for the scans as he had planned. But she thinks the headache had something to do with his disappearance. Mandy believes Con must have had some kind of medical episode, because there's no other way to explain his behaviour that morning. She still hasn't had a funeral for her husband, but says she now thinks of him as having passed away up there on Mount Buller. Police are still hopeful that one day they'll be able to tell the families of Carol Clay, Russell Hill, Niels Becker and Conrad Whitlock what happened to their loved ones. Senior Sergeant Greg Paul, who leads Victoria's search and rescue squad, says having no answers at all is the worst possible outcome for the families. It is the not knowing. It is the cruelest result of all, he says. If anyone has information about these disappearances, we urge you to contact Crime Stoppers on 1800 333 000, or you can place an anonymous tip with a link in the description. Thank you all for listening.